What's happening, guys and girls? Acrinator here, and welcome to yet another attempt to clear out my backlog of games that I've finished and have yet to review. Today we'll be covering the last of the SuperGiant titles that I own. I ran out of ideas for what to say for this intro, so let's get straight into this review of Transistor. Transistor is a top-down-esque action role-playing game with turn-based mechanics developed and published by SuperGiant Games. I won't be going through the entire early history of SuperGiant like I did for the last review, since I already did that once. Plus, Transistor is their second game, Bastion is their first, so I felt it more appropriate for that review in particular. Despite Bastion being released first, Transistor is actually the game that introduced me to SuperGiant's work, only later grabbing their first title to try out for myself. So I had no preconceived notion of what to expect when grabbing this game. I like the look of the art, the music in the trailers sounded good, and it already had received critical acclaim. Needless to say, I didn't feel too guilty about picking it up on sale for about $1.50. If you don't know this about me already, I generally go for RPGs, but I usually don't bother with strategy-heavy games like what Transistor had advertised itself to be, or at the very least that it had some strategy elements to it. Despite that though, I decided there'd only be so much regret if I ended up despising the game. That's the benefit of buying games on sale, I guess. Starting up the game for the first time and looking around, there were things that I liked and things that I immediately criticized. Transistor definitely lives up to its reputation of having a great art style, but there are some user interface issues that I'm surprised aren't highlighted more when others cover this title, but I'll get more into that with more detail a bit later on. It's often said that first impressions can last a lifetime, and with video games, a promotional poster or the box art is usually what introduces us to the rest of the product. This was no different for me when first noticing Transistor's official art on the Steam store during a sale. Cyberpunk has never really been my thing because it usually entails a dark and dreary future in some dystopian city, but Transistor was different. It was colorful. Just look at the cover art. It has actual life thrown into the mix. Instead of this giant city with nothing but gray, it feels like this is a place that you'd want to visit in real life. Concepts like culture and creativity feel like a possibility here, and that's just taken from a still image. I'm no art major, so I couldn't tell you what color palette was used in the making of this game, but what I can tell you is that it's incredibly vibrant. It gives the city personality, and still manages to be easy on the eyes through it all. Not once did I ever feel like I was being overwhelmed by what was on screen, which is saying something considering the wide array of sights to see. Even when the world crumbles around you and the scenery becomes more bleak, there's still plenty to marvel at, albeit for different reasons. And this doesn't just include the background panels painted far off in the distance, but also what's right in front of you, and even what you control directly. There's tons of little effects to do with walking around, entering a save terminal, and especially the combat that are wholly unique. Not a single ability you acquire through your playthrough will look the same as another, and they all do exactly what they look like they do. You won't be running around creating massive explosions only to feel like the enemies are bullet sponges. If it looks like it hurts, chances are it does. Though my absolute favorite artistic direction in the sense of what you can see has to be in the main character. Looking back to the cover art, you'll notice that the city hosts plenty of colors including various blues, yellows, and tinted greens, but what you won't see that much of is red. This hue is reserved for more important characteristics, things that you don't want to miss, and it's used with great effect. It stands out like a sore thumb, and yet it manages to fit in nicely with everything else around it. You won't come across this color that much, but when you do, you should probably be paying attention, and I think it's all the more fitting that oftentimes the largest quantity of it that we see on the screen at any given time is from our aptly named protagonist, Red. It's a SuperGiant game, so you can be pretty sure that they know what they're doing when it comes to telling a story that'll make your heart wrench. Tragic would definitely be an appropriate way to describe much of what you'll experience throughout the standard playthrough, though there's also an air of acceptance beneath it all. Unlike Bastion, where you're progressing with the hope of fixing the shattering world, Transistor takes a much more mature approach. There's no delusion of being able to save the world. Hell, there's no guarantee you'll be able to save yourself. Before the game even starts, you fail at saving a single human life. Ironic that this is the very essence that encourages and pushes you through the hardships by taking on the role of the narrator. We have some semblance of familiarity with the mystery man and the sword, and while it's not impossible to piece together who he may have been, we're kept somewhat in the dark with shallow seeds of doubt planted in our subconscious as we progress. Of course, everything seems to be resolved by the ending, but I would like to give credit to SuperGiant for making us think, if ever so slightly. It's not always easy to make a story that's more realistic in the face of catastrophe. Anyone who's ever watched Neon Genesis Evangelion can sympathize. stories. There's a very fine line to be straddled in trying to dispel the notion that a magic wand can simply undo all that's happened up till now, and creating a narrative that's nothing but doom and gloom. The philosophical side of stories such as this can only be explored so thoroughly before it becomes contrived, and thankfully that's a balance SuperGiant respected when crafting Transistor. I know I gushed during the Bastion review about how good of a composer Darren Korb is, but seriously, this man is on an entirely different level. Bastion's soundtrack fits with the Calm Frontier-esque style of the game, but Transistor is something else. It's only appropriate that a story taking place in a city, the likes of which we've never seen, has a backing track that we could have never comprehended before now. This is easily the most hauntingly beautiful music I have ever heard, and it's easily my favorite OST of all time. I never go out of my way to listen to movie or game soundtracks outside of their intended context. But this one is different. I constantly find myself going back and listening to these songs and their corrupted versions over and over again. Seriously, just listen to the music in the background of this video to hear what I'm talking about. During my initial playthrough of Transistor, when I came across the game's first boss, Sybil, I just stopped and listened to this song from the pause menu for a good 5 minutes. I love the lyrics that simultaneously sound desperate and furious. I love how it can be portrayed as both the boss and Red singing, and I love how the song slowly shifts its style over the course of the fight to fit the narrative. If there's anything that I could complain about with this game, and these are minor gripes at that, it would have to do with the gameplay itself. While the game does feel smooth and relatively fair in the combat, it can take a while to get used to for newcomers. It took me about 7 hours to beat the game the first time, and the first 3 or so hours of that were wrestling with the controls. I'm not talking about the movements, more so the intricacies of the customization in your skill set. There aren't really any good tutorials given that help the player explain what they're supposed to be doing to maximize their efficiency. Granted, once you do get the hang of it, you're golden, but it takes some effort to get to that point. I think Bastion did a much better job in this regard, partially due to the fact that they kept everything simple. With increased potential in the combat system comes a larger learning curve, and I don't think SuperGiant appropriately addressed this issue this time around. Though, while it will take someone with no previous experience some time to find their bearings, it's not impossible. Once you see the pattern in the design, you should be able to piece together how everything else works. Unfortunately, this isn't the end to the troubles you'll face, however, because knowing how the system works and being efficient are two entirely different things. Through leveling up and progression through the storyline, you'll come across a few dozen different abilities that you can augment your powers with. These can be anything from dashing around the arena, causing explosions, or even summoning allies to fight for you. The problem is that very few of these abilities are worth utilizing. There's an extremely small pool of skills you acquire that are effective at dealing with enemies, and the rest are really only useful in their power to augment said attacks. While every ability can be used as either a base attack or an augmentation of another skill, or even Red herself, there's probably only 5 or 6 that are worth considering as primary attacks. There is some skill that comes into play when considering what abilities could use what augmentations the most, and there is something to be said about customization for everyone's own playstyle, but it would be nice if at the very least a few more abilities felt useful on their own. A concept that makes this all the worse is something that I personally resent quite a bit: punishing death. To me, death in a game is a punishment itself for making mistakes, so further punishing the player for their failures is only serving to salt the wound. In Transistor, you don't simply die when your life bar hits 0, but instead it's replenished with one less ability at your disposal. It's nice and all that you get a few chances before dying, but I'd personally rather just retry the fight with all my abilities intact instead of having to deal without them for a short period of time, especially considering that I'm obviously having trouble fighting in my current state, so what makes you think that I'll do any better with one less attack? At the very least, take one of the augmentations at random and allow the player to use that as a replacement. It's still subpar to what we had, but at least we're not completely shit out of luck then. While you do have to earn lost abilities back over the course of a specified number of save terminals, that won't really help anyone that's still trying to get past a single damn fight. I've been lucky or perhaps skilled enough to never get far enough to be truly helpless, but I'd have to imagine that someone's had the misfortune, and this gameplay mechanic doesn't do enough to negate the problem. Thankfully, Transistor isn't really that difficult, at least not on the normal settings. You may have to deal with rather clunky UI, but the opponents ramp up at a reasonable difficulty. You're gradually introduced to new and more powerful enemies only after fighting against their weaker counterparts. Despite the fact that some enemies like these dog-looking little shits are borderline infuriating to kill, you are given a reasonable introduction to what they do and how to defeat them. And it is important to note what I said at the beginning of this section, that these issues that I bring up are mostly negligible. The learning curve could definitely be mitigated by more attention given in the early stages of the game, and the punishment of death can be quite annoying when it happens, but they won't really bother you for too long. Like I said before, once you learn how the game systems work, everything else starts to fall into place. You are also able to experiment enough that you should be able to figure out what abilities are best to use, especially considering you're given some of the better ones before the first boss fight even happens. And when it comes to dying and losing your abilities temporarily, you probably aren't ever going to die aside from the occasional boss fight. Even then, you probably won't fall more than once or twice max. So you should still have something to fight with by the end of it, despite it probably not being optimal. So all in all, Transistor is a great game. While I hold Bastion in slightly higher regard for the systems and mechanics it has in place, I think this one edges out slightly in regards to the more artsy aspects. Both of SuperGiant's first two games are some of my favorites of all time, and it's very difficult to find anything else to say about them besides the utmost praise. It's for these reasons that I find myself giving Transistor a 9.7 out of 10. It definitely doesn't feel as smooth in most regards compared to its predecessor, but it's still an incredible game with tons to enjoy. Though the standard playthrough will only last you somewhere between 4 to 7 hours, it's well worth allowing yourself to get sucked into this world. At the time of this review, Transistor can be found on pretty much every platform imaginable besides Xbox, and is sold on just about every storefront you could think of when it comes to PC. Normally it sells for $20, but it goes on sale for quite a lot off a few times a year, so I'd recommend waiting if you have the patience. Well, I hope you all enjoyed this formal review, and if you did, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more like it, maybe even subscribe. Links to my social media and whatnot are in the description below. And as for the comment question, if you've played through the game yourself, or even if you've just watched my playthrough on livestream, what do you think of Transistor's ending? I don't want to elaborate any more than that to avoid spoilers for anyone who cares about that sort of stuff and is still watching, but leave your comment down below. Also, it might be a good idea to write spoilers above the read more fold if you do want to discuss this in the comments. Anyways, that's all the time we've got for today, so until next time, don't die.